Welcome to Mapping the Manifesto. Very excited to be back at Eradicate Hate. This is my third year, so I'm an Eradicate Hate veteran. Last year I had to join remotely because I was in New York City, so it's very nice to be back here in person, and the conference itself has just grown tremendously. So very pleased to be here and see how much it's grown and evolved. I'm here with Brad Galloway and Michael Waltman. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. My name is Colin Clarke. I'm the Director of Research at the Soufan Group. Longtime ties to Pittsburgh. I did my PhD at GISPIA at the University of Pittsburgh, worked at RAND for 10 years, and then also was a professor at Carnegie Mellon before joining the Soufan Group. So, Michael?
Yeah.
Please.
I'm Mike Waltman. I'm an associate professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I guess for about the last 20 years or so, I've been doing research on hatred as a persuasive resource. And so I've been trying to look at different kinds of texts that are important for the identity formation of different groups or different people, and to look at how those texts are being used.
Brad.
I'm Brad Galloway. I'm the coordinator at the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism, which is at Ontario Tech University. I'm also a caseworker with the Organization for the Prevention of Violence, which is an intervention program in Alberta. And also I work with Life After Hate as an exit specialist, helping people leave the far-right movements.
Thank you so much, and honored to be here with both of these distinguished speakers today. Michael, let's start with you. You've done a lot of work on heuristics and why heuristics are important to the manipulation of hate and hate speech. Can you speak about some of this work and how we should think about heuristics in terms of far-right manifestos?
Sure. To begin with, cognitive heuristics are little cognitive shortcuts that people employ when they have to make difficult decisions. The more burdensome the decision, the more likely they are to turn to some kind of heuristic in order to make that decision. Generally, the research that started with heuristics kind of looked at how individuals kind of latched onto them on their own. More recently, in the area of persuasion and social influence, researchers have looked at how sometimes unscrupulous rhetors may attempt to encourage our use of heuristics by how they craft and shape their messages. And it probably wouldn't be much of a surprise to anyone to understand that when hate in general is manipulated, it's manipulated as a kind of rhetorical trick, right? People writing these manifestos are not trying to encourage people to think deeply and reflectively. They're trying to get them to process a persuasive message superficially and more or less kind of trick them into compliance. So that was on my mind as I was looking at these manifestos and thinking about some concept that would be useful for trying to understand these heuristics. And so I identified about 4 kinds of heuristics that were being utilized by people within the manifesto. A kind of credibility heuristic, right? You should comply with my persuasive request because I have the authority to speak on this matter, and I am trustworthy. A likability heuristic operates when you should comply with my persuasive request because I am likable or I express ideas that you will find likable. One of my colleagues, Ashley Mattheis, provided probably one of the best examples of this liking heuristic that I'm aware of. She said, just think about, the young people who follow influencers. And very often these influencers make a lot of money just simply because they're told to do something, right? People like this influencer, and they want to be like the influencer, and so they buy things from the influencer. Another kind of heuristic is a kind of commitment consistency heuristic. You should comply with this persuasive request because it is something that you have done in the past or you should comply with this heuristic because your ancestors would like you to comply with this request. And then finally, one kind of heuristic that I found was a scarcity heuristic. You should comply with this persuasive request because if you do not comply with this persuasive request, white people are a scarce resource. And so what I might do just real quickly is to kind of try to summarize as briefly as possible some of what's going on with, in terms of the consistency commitment heuristic. Readers are encouraged to kill the enemies of the Aryan race specifically because their Aryan ancestors would want them to. These Aryan ancestors have prepared Western civilization and the United States. This is our inheritance, and to fail to defend that inheritance amounts to essentially a kind of genocide. In terms of credibility, the Buffalo shooter spent about 100 pages describing the planning that he put into this kind of shooting, which included a kind of recognizance on the store. He visited the store a number of times at different times of the day in order to try to find the best time in which he would have a kind of target-rich sort of environment. In addition to that, he was live streaming the actual shooting, and he spent a fair amount of time. He spent a fair amount of time preparing people for this kind of shooting spree. So these tactics allowed him to establish his credibility and to persuade readers to take up weapons to kill the enemies of the Aryan race. Finally, in terms of likability, this is a shooter who tried to bathe himself in the likability of people who were important to potential readers. He talked about how he was influenced by various shooters in other shootings that were important to them. He used slogans that reflected his own beliefs, so he'd talk about the 14-word slogan without necessarily mentioning it, but his audience, that was almost an infamy for his audience, right? He was, they were able to kind of understand what he was doing as he was kind of moving through there. So he creates a kind of liking and almost a kind of identification, right? So that's a real quick thumbnail sketch of what I've found in terms of these heuristics.
Really interesting breakdown, and quite a number of similarities to the work that I've done, my own research on jihadi terrorism. So again, we're seeing this kind of overlap. Jacob Ware and I have pursued a line of research where we've looked at far-right attacks through the lens of the near-enemy, far-enemy paradigm, and so a lot of this is resonating with me now, as well as some of the trends we've seen in the manifestos, a focus on tactics, techniques, and procedures, a real focus on the aesthetics of the attack preparation, down to these really minute details of what kind of socks you should be wearing. I mean, really kind of obsessive stuff where you see these attackers put so much time and energy into these types of details, seemingly innocuous. At the same time, they're going into this knowing very likely that they're going to be killed in the attack or plan to kill themselves, and yet something that they're so passionate about, they still don't have the energy to be original. They're plagiarizing large chunks of text from one another, and so there's all these little wrinkles that I just find odd yet fascinating in a somewhat macabre way. Live streaming and then the kind of callback to other shooters, right? Almost in a way that academics would cite each other in a paper, you're seeing these far-right attackers call back to one another, specifics of certain attacks, et cetera. Brad, I'd like to ask you, we talk a lot at conferences like this about disinformation, about conspiracy theories. Can you elaborate on, how prominent conspiracy theories are in some of these manifestos, and what do we know about this?
I mean, we can start out by saying I think these manifestos are laden with this conspiracy theory stuff. I mean, anything from huge example here, the Christchurch manifesto was literally called the Great Replacement. So we look at those types of things, and we know the Great Replacement as one of the biggest conspiracy theories that exists out there.
Also one promoted by mainstream media commentators these days, so it's gotten a lot of airplay.
Yeah, it's sort of made its way the extreme into the mainstream in that sense too. Yeah, and I think a lot of what we're seeing too is across these are tropes about Jewish world domination. Of course, that's under these things as well, and that whites are under attack. I mean, this is not an unfamiliar territory with violent far-right groups across the gamut over decades. It's been something that they've used to, they're saying they're protectors of the white race, things like this. And that's in terms of the different demographics. And then of course we see things like a sinister liberal agenda is a more like generalized thing, that it's this liberal agenda that's out to destroy white culture, stuff like that. One of the older junk race science and IQ, we see that come up a lot in these manifestos.
Dylan Roofs, in particular, had a lot of that.
In the anti-black racism stuff as well. And then, it's just, I mean, without these sort of root cause conspiracy theories, these guys really have nothing. So they kind of borrow from each other too, with whatever works for whatever their root belief is and whatever their victim target is. And some of them are really, really, like you were suggesting, 100 pages. Like these guys are really descriptive about how they want these conspiracies to link together and cause some frame of legacy for their specific manifestos.
When in doubt, you can always sprinkle some George Soros on top, right? I mean, no good conspiracy goes without a Soros name check. I think it pops up. But again, I mean, also in regular mainstream media, these same things are kind of being elevated, and then it makes people that are curious about them wonder, maybe there is some credence to these conspiracy theories because look, Fox News is saying it, or another network is saying it. Some really heinous stuff, in my opinion. Michael, can you speak to some of your work on hate-motivated novels, things like the Turner Diaries, Siege, White Apocalypse, and how are the manifestos that we've seen related to some of these novels in terms of top-down or bottom-up organization?
Yeah, perhaps because of some of my own experience, my recent experiences, I see these manifestos as really an extension of those kinds of racist novels that are intended to socialize people, to recruit people, that are intended to provide a group with a kind of collective identity that they can kind of get behind in a set of core beliefs that they can all subscribe to, and that will motivate their identity-motivated kinds of bias. You have to construct someone as worthy of killing before you actually killing. And so, in the same way that books like the Turner Diaries, White Apocalypse operate to do precisely those kinds of things, these manifestos do as well. They're drawing upon real similar kinds of beliefs. I think there's a difference between those novels and these manifestos. The novels have tended to be top-down texts. They're texts that are distributed down the hierarchy to ordinary Ku Klux Klan members, to ordinary neo-Nazis, to ordinary neo-pagans, right? The manifestos are a kind of bottom-up text. These are texts that are written by the people who are going to take it upon themselves to take lives, right? And I think we've kind of talked about this a little bit before, but I've kind of still been trying to think through the implications of that. And I think there are some important implications, but Now, I'm not satisfied that I have come up with, everything that is important, right? I think they can become perhaps an even more important source of identification for people reading these manifestos because they're a bottom-up text, right? Most fascists need militias, and in that sense, the manifestos are a kind of bottom-up text in the same way that militias are a kind of bottom-up movement.
I guess just one quick follow-on is, I've heard some scholars be somewhat dismissive of the importance of these texts, and I've pushed back against that quite a bit because I think, if you look at folks like Timothy McVeigh, how much something like the Turner Diaries resonated with him, right? He was selling this at gun shows. He was showing up to, major events and had this in the back of his car. So,
Right.
Can you just speak a little bit about the importance of these texts to the individual attackers themselves, vice the movement?
Yeah. I sometimes liken these texts to my grandmother's Bible. My grandmother had a Bible that was worn and frayed. It always seemed like it was worn and frayed. And it was worn and frayed because she carried that Bible around with her every day. Whenever she encountered a problem, she had a verse to go to. If she was concerned about something her grandson was doing, she had a verse to kind of go to. And so, she was making daily reference to this. And I think that people within the hate movement make similar use of these manifestos. There are other texts, of course, that they're using. But that was the same way they used the Turner Diaries, right? You talk about this, Timothy McVeigh was well known for saying, hey, I've got an interesting book here. Why don't you read it? And then we'll talk about it. I'd really like to hear your ideas. So I think in that way, these manifestos should not be so easily dismissed.
No, I agree, and I think they have a real shelf life. It gives some longevity to the movement in a way that, and especially in the online era, right, where this isn't just a hard copy. This is something that can be distributed easily at scale over and over again, and kind of once it's out there, quote unquote, in the wild, it's not something that you can take down and kind of put back in the box.
And if you sort of, that's actually an important source of persuasion when you think about it. I sometimes talk about self-forms of persuasion when I teach persuasion, and that's essentially what people are doing when they turn to these manifestos, when they put in their earbuds and they listen to hate music all day long, right? This is just another form of self-persuasion because it's a continual reinforcement of the beliefs and the ideologies.
Keeping in line with this, this line of inquiry, Brad, are manifestos intended to leave a legacy for the followers of individual terrorist perpetrators, groups, movement? And can you speak a bit about the concept of martyrdom, which is something that I've studied closely myself in the jihadi sphere, but this has particular resonance with far-right groups as well.
Yeah, I think some of the things here that I note are, there has to be a clear expression of their worldview and justification of their actions. But the legacy is really thickly worn into, this final testament of their beliefs and what they want to leave behind. And even we go back into the times of the order and things like that. These movements are heavily associated with it is being a martyr for these things is a very important part of this, whether it's death by police or suicide yourself and that kind of thing. I think they also get into this other sort of mantra where it's like worshiping the guy before too, right? So that part, they're calling it these days saint worship, things like that.
Yeah.
So the way they refer to the guys before, for instance, the Buffalo attacker worshiped the Christchurch guy, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of that interwoven stuff going on. Basically, Tarrant, for instance, wanted to be a symbol, like past folks, and that martyrdom or that effect of these attacks is very important to these guys. And lastly, to inspire others to do more atrocities like these.
And we see this across various violent non-state actor groups, whether it's jihadi groups, whether it's the Irish Republican Army and hunger strikers, right? They're held up as martyrs. These are people that died for the movement. That helps bring in money into the organization. It helps recruit new members. It helps radicalize others, and it gives a sense, I think, of durability to some of these movements, particularly in lean times or when when their ideologies are really kind of being challenged. I want to go back to Michael because you spoke a little bit before about identity-motivated violence, and I think, when you turn on the TV today and you look at the news and you look at kind of congressional hearings, what's happening, so much of what we're fighting over in a very polarized United States, to me, at its core, is about identity, right? And that gets dragged into all of these conversations. So can you talk a little bit more about the work you've done and what the implications of your research are for intervening in the engagement of identity-motivated violence?
Yeah. Give me just a minute to kind of gather my thoughts on that.
Yeah.
I think in terms of interventions, if I'm just kind of tying it to the use of heuristics within these kinds of manifestos, there is, one one positive point that can come from this, right? That is that if you look at how long persuasion lasts between this kind of heuristically driven process, when you're influenced by a heuristic, or as opposed to when you're influenced by the quality of an argument that someone is making, right? The persuasion lasts longer, if you have people processing the persuasive message kind of centrally, kind of reflectively. You're getting a person listening to claims and comparing them to the evidence, right, that they are hearing. Persuasion through the heuristic route lasts. It can work, but it lasts a shorter period of time, right? So that may give us, and I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say is that point of intervention right now, but that suggests that there may be a point of intervention, right, in which people have been persuaded heuristically, and they're about at the end of the line, right? So I think what that suggests is that there is at some point a point at which we can intervene. And I think that intervention probably ought to occur through argument that is both heuristic and highly reflective.
Is it a cognitive opening of sorts of the individual that you're trying to reach? I mean, I think about it as almost the inverse of how they got into this in the first place, right?
Yeah.
All of the different factors and variables that go into someone searching or seeking this out, right? That meaning in their life, that identity that fulfills them. On the flip side of that, are they going through similar things that provide this opening where they may be ready and willing to talk about, and you've got a lot of experience in this, exiting the movement?
We were listening to a discussion with a former here earlier, right? And one of the things that he talked about was that hatred is so toxic that it poisons relationships. It poisons one's self, and it's just hard to kind of live that toxicity every single day. And so, people kind of reach a point at which they may begin to look for exits out of the hate movement.
I think I've heard you say those exact words almost verbatim in terms of the baggage and the exhaustion from carrying these thoughts around.
Yeah, it is 100%. That is an intervention point where you can see people's exhaustion with it. Like immersing yourself in in my work, when I'm helping people leave, a lot of these guys have gotten into different manifestos and have read them, even seen them as an inspiration. But the stuff that's in there and those conspiracies and all that stuff has taken such a toll on these people and made them become so exhausted by all of this information that's going on. So that is a point of, where we can talk these things through and try to work it out with these guys about trying to break down those things. We're not trying to, brainwash them to think something else. It's just at least getting an opening to talk about how those things are causing them to be that person that they are now, exhausted by this hate, violence, fear, all those things.
Yeah.
Causes anxiety, all of these other things that they're going through, and that's where we help these folks get the resources to get the help.
And you can imagine the kinds of self-persuasion that someone has to engage in over a period of time, the exhaustion that kind of creates, right? Listening to hate music all day long. As you go from your job to your home, the effort that it takes to pick up these texts and to review them and to remind yourself why you hate the people that you hate, right? I think, it's that point of exhaustion that can be an intervention point.
100%.
I think it's also, once they realize that they're doing that in that activity of over and over telling themselves they hate something, it's so much easier to just go, nah, I'm not listening to that anymore. Like it's a much easier thing to do in the equation than force yourself and immerse yourself into that stuff day in, day out. And so, once we get that realization across, sometimes it's quite interesting, the outcomes.
Yeah. We're running up on time. We have a couple of minutes left, so I want to ask my panelists to think of any kind of parting shots or kind of quick one minute hits of something you think that we should have covered but didn't. I'll put out there something that I've been thinking a lot about, and that's emerging technologies and manifestos. And with the advent of things like ChatGPT, how do people, nefarious actors, harness those things, right? Because I unfortunately have to read all these manifestos, and as a former Carnegie Mellon professor, I struggle with the grammar mostly, I think, besides the content, which is disgusting. But I wonder if we start seeing ChatGPT generated manifestos, right? If it's not happening already, and there's probably some smart people from the tech sector working on this, but that's something that I've always looked at, right? Is this kind of and David Gartenstein-Ross, who is the previous moderator, and I wrote a piece for Lawfare some years ago where we talked about something called the violent non-state actor technology adoption curve, right?
Yeah.
How they kind of interact with different technologies, and it's always a game of cat and mouse. So, any parting shots of things that you want to leave the audience with?
I would just kind of reiterate that that kind of artificial intelligence might actually improve the quality of what we're reading. So we might find it a little bit more pleasurable.
And then I think on the other side too, are there tools that can help us deal with this in a way where they're not getting in front of so many eyeballs, or there are other points where someone goes to click on something, and I think Moonshot's done some really good work in this area that diverts them and brings them some other information in front of their face. Brad, anything to leave us with?
Stay tuned. We're working on a project right now on analysis of a lot of manifestos, and as you reading through these, it's not the greatest situation that I could have asked for, but however, we're learning a lot along the way here to figure out maybe some similarities, some intervention points, some different things where we can action these items in the work that we're doing to help folks lead these organizations as well.
Well, as somebody that's involved with the working group on mapping the manifesto, you can bet I'll be knocking at your door for you to maybe share some of the insights from what you've gleaned from looking at so many.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
Thank you again. Really appreciate the time, and hope you enjoyed this session. Look forward to the rest of the week here. Thank you very much.